Good morning. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. We have, for this small and intimate group, a wonderful program today. We're going to explore something new. We're going to explore not just the issue of how much damage Russia's aggression in Ukraine has inflicted on Ukraine in the commercial sector, but ways that Ukraine can seek compensation through the court system. We have two panels today, and we also have a speaker from Kiev, Dmytro Shymkiv, who will be coming to you via Skype. I think you have your program in front of you. You have all the speakers' biographies. I will just note Mr. Shymkiv has been working for Mr. Poroshenko, President Poroshenko, since the first months of Poroshenko's presidency. He was a major executive, the Microsoft rep in Kiev, a reformer, someone with a broad vision, and we're delighted to have him with us today, if only at a distance. Dmytro, over to you. Or not.
He's moving.
I think he's... Sorry?
See, he's right there.
We can see him.
Can you hear us?
Do you want to talk to him?
Dmytro, can you hear us? Because we're having trouble hearing you. Nod your head if you can hear us. Is he nodding his head? Yeah, I think he is. We heard him on the test. Tactiles.
He's not speaking, so.
Now we hear you for the first time. So if you may I ask you to start again. Oh boy. Can you hear me now? We hear you. If there's some way to convey to him that we hear me. You're hearing me now? Hello? All right. Is there some way to connect with him via landline? Just tell him to proceed since we seem to be hearing him. We hear you just fine. And you told him we heard him? You heard we hear him? Hello? Can you hear me now? Okay. We hear you fine. Do you hear us? Terrific. Proceed. Can you hear me now?
For having me here today in this form of presence with the technology. So I hope you see my slides, and I would like to use this opportunity to thank you, Atlantic Council, for organizing the very important meeting, particularly discussing the economic impact of the annexation of Crimea and occupation of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions by Russian Federation. And just to start and kick it off, I think that unfortunately there is a lot of political debates and discussions around human rights violation, the crimes of war that is taking place both in Donetsk, Lugansk region, but also in Crimea. At the same time, very little being said about real economic impact that we face in Ukraine, and in particularly in Crimea and Donetsk. So just to start, let's look at the Crimea. I think when we talk about the Crimea and Russian annexation, illegal annexation of Crimea, in 2013, Crimea represented 3.6% of Ukrainian GDP. It's been contributing 1.5% of Ukrainian export. Very important element, it is oil and gas reserves. It represents 80% of the oil and gas reserves that are of the Black Sea on Ukrainian shelf. It's 1.6 trillion cubic meters of reserves. Besides that, there was already investments that's been done in terms of infrastructure, the drill rigs, etc., and they have been valued to more than $800 million. When we're looking at the transshipment capacity, it represents 10% of transshipment capacities that's been the Crimean ports being used for export of grains and other cargoes. It's 4 million tons of grains that's been exported through Crimean ports. Besides that, with the annexation of Crimea, there was a period where there was a prohibition of passing merchant ships through the Kerch Strait. And this is important because this is the access to Mariupol, where the shipment of the metal been taking place. Between 4 to 4.5 million Ukrainians spend vacations each year in Crimea. And this is, again, when we look at the overall damage of the occupation from some of economic terms, we see that annually it exists $100 billion. And this is, when we talk about some of the largest Ukrainian enterprises in Crimea, because I think everybody knows Crimea as a recreational zones, but it actually has a very significant big enterprises that are operating in Crimea. So let's start with the largest producer of titanium dioxide in Eastern Europe. It's the largest producer of titanium dioxide in Eastern Europe. Its capacity was the production capacity of 2 workshops, Titan 1 and Titan 2, had a design capacity for 40,000 tons per year each. Seized. Chernomornaftogaz. This is the largest Ukrainian oil gas exploration production company. It had 100% shares belonged to the state-owned company Naftogaz Ukraine. The next one is Soda Crimean plant. And this is leading enterprise in the production of technical soda, which is very critical for a lot of production and manufacturing processes for the rest of Ukrainian territory and Ukrainian plants. It's located in the city Krasnoperekopsk, and its design capacity, again, what is important is the numbers. Its design capacity almost 700,000 tons per year. 700,000 tons per year. It provides almost about 80% of domestic market needs and 2.5% of the world soda supply. So the Soda Crimea plant was supplying 2.5% of the world market of soda ash. This is just to give you a perspective. The importance of Crimea is not just recreational zone or port zone or access to the infrastructure. Another one is Fialand plant. It's one of the big machine building enterprise, one of the largest producer of power tools in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Finally, probably known by many people in the audience, is Massandra. Massandra is one of the biggest in Ukraine and in Crimea, and one of the oldest in the world manufacturer of the wines. The collection of Massandra wine, and just the number, it's about 1 million bottles. It's a collection. We're not talking about production. We're talking about collection of 1 million bottles, which is one of the largest heritage in the world. And it's and been registered in 1998 in the Guinness Book Records. This is all been seized. So this is gives you first the perspective or economic perspective of the big enterprises and as well as macroeconomics of impact on Ukraine with the annexation of Crimea. But let's now move to the Russian occupation of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. First, Donbas in 2013, pre-war, was representing 15% of Ukrainian GDP. It has 24% of Ukraine's industrial production, 24%. 23% of Ukrainian commodity export. It was primary metallurgy and machine building, and the tax revenue to the state was $12 billion. So $12 billion was a direct hit of annual impact on their Ukrainian economy with occupation on the Donetsk and Lugansk region. Before occupation, 45% of Ukrainian thermal power stations were needed anthracite coal. And this is important because it's a heating things for particularly we still have winter in Ukraine, you know, we still have snow and etc. And that's why the heating is critical. Out of 150 mines that are located in Donbas region, currently 100 is on occupied territories. 100 mines that actually create a lack of supply for Ukrainian thermal power stations of special anthracite coal, which requires significant investment into redesign of the performance of the thermal power station. Before war, before occupation, almost 74,000 legal entities, especially businesses, were operating in the Donbas and Lugansk regions. The total assets of the banks that's been seized, which were state banks, was 800 million assets. The assets of other banks, 3.6 billion. From the transportation infrastructure, Ukrainian railways were holding more than 30,000 private and public carriages. So there's a significant infrastructure that is present in Donetsk and Lugansk region being seized, and it's a critical infrastructure which used to supply and deliver goods and export potential of Ukraine to the Azov Sea and further to the export. Now let's look at the biggest enterprises in the occupied Donetsk and Lugansk region. What Russia's strategy been around this region? There is three main things that happened to the businesses, big businesses in this region. First, some of the plants like Kharkiv machine building plant, like Lugansk Teplovoz, Lugansk machine building plant, being taken and deported to Russia. So think about this, the plant being disassembled, loaded into trucks and the trains and shipped to Russia. This is a 100% stealing of Ukrainian assets. The second category is inactive or destroyed, disassembled enterprises. Basically been destroyed, cut into scrap and completely destroyed. And the others are the ones that are still performing on the territory of the occupied Donetsk and Lugansk region. But when we talk about the performance of these institutions, organizations, and the businesses, it's very important to again look at what they really represent. Let's look at their some of them. The first one is Donetsk Steel. Donetsk Steel was located in Donetsk. It used to be largest Ukrainian producer of merchant pig iron. It was one of the first globally to introduce PCI technology. One of the first globally. In 2013, it employed 10,000 people. Think about this. The plant was completely destroyed and it employed 10,000 people. The gross income in 2013 was $275 million US. The plant that was generating revenue of 275 million was destroyed. The production in terms of volume, just to give a perspective, it was 1.5 million metric tons per year, and very often I ask my team to look at the comparison to the US companies. So basically Donetsk Steel was comparative to the Miller and Company LLC. So there is American company, Miller and Company LLC, which has a similar type of production. Just think about this, that it suddenly disappeared and the people are unemployed and the whole destruction of the production. Another one which is continued to operate is Yanakiv metallurgical plant. Yanakiv is a fully integrated iron and steel producer consisting of Yanakiv Iron and Steel Works, and they operate as a joint production site. It's one of the world's leading concast billet producer. World's leading. Again, think about how often I'm mentioning biggest, world leading, one of the leading in the region or the globally. It used to produce producing 2.5 million tons of pig iron, 2.7 million tons of crude steel, 1 million tons of raw products. It employed almost 6,500 people. And comparative is the commercial metals core. It's a steel and metal manufacturer in the Irving, Texas. So this is it continued to operate. So think about this plant, which is still operating in the occupied territory, producing a similar volumes, and run by who? By the folks who run with the guns, running a plant of 6,500 employees with such a volume and such complexity of production require a management that's coming from Moscow. These plants are run by Russians because there is no capacity left within the occupied Donetsk and Lugansk region with the ability to run the operations of such plants on on that scale. Let's look further. The Zasyadka mine is one of the historical mines of Donbas. It's located in Donetsk city. It has been operating since 1958, and it's designed to produce capacity of 1.5 tons of coal per year. 1.5 tons of coal per year. The total amount of employees, 4.6 thousand employees. 4.6 thousand employees. Still operating. Think about this, that this type of plant continue to operate and somebody is running it. And it's definitely not the guys with the guns. Herbst pipe plant. It's a plant in Herbst, the largest CIS country's producer of stride pipes, electric welded pipes. Capacity, again, 1.6 million tons per year. 1.6 million tons. The total of employee, 2,500. Now about a bit of recreational and masterpiece. I know that I see some people in the audience who've been to Ukraine, so still before the occupation of Russia, and everybody's seen Donbas Arena. Donbas Arena is a stadium located in the city of Donetsk. It's designed for 50,000 spectators. The total investment into this stadium was 175 million euros. This is one of the first stadium in Eastern Europe which received a so-called standard of 5-star category. Under UEFA and FIFA, it has a statement. It has a category of class elite stadium. Again, it's still there. It's still operated by somebody. So in February 2017, terrorists captured completely the stadium. Another big plants like Nord was largest producer of household appliances. Stirol was also one of the major ammonia and urea producer and the only polystyrene manufacturer in Ukraine. It represents, Stirol represents 1% of the global nitrogen fertilizers production. 1% of global production being seized on the occupied territories. So we have some of the things that I mentioned on the slide that you see. One company I haven't mentioned yet, it's Topaz. People who've been with the military or at least follow the scandals of the famous Kolchuga, this is Topaz, is the manufacturer of the complex radio engineering systems, which has a nickname Kolchuga. Kolchuga is the one that's been allegedly put on Ukraine of secret shipments to Iraq. This equipment, basically it's radio technical intelligence and early warning systems, being also seized and cut in pieces and transported to Russia. So that was my introduction, our opening comments, to give you a perspective of what's really happening in the Crimea and occupied territories of Donetsk and Lugansk region. I tried to give you a story about big plants. I tried to give you a story of big businesses that's been seized by Russia, and many of them continue to operate for the benefits of Russian economy. That's a brilliant piracy which has been taking place during the last 4 years. Thank you very much, and if there is any questions, I will be happy to answer. Because I don't hear you.
Dmytro, that was a wonderful presentation.
I don't hear.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
I can't hear.
Well, even though you can't hear me, thank you very much, and we will let you know another way that we appreciate your wonderful presentation. And with that, Melinda, why don't you put your panel up?
Here in the middle, yep. Anders, you're on the end. You're right here next to me.
Can't read my name.
Okay. And this is your clicker. That should be on. Good morning. My name is Melinda Haring. I'm the editor of the UkraineAlert blog here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for coming out to learn more about Dr. Anders Åslund's fantastic new report. If you didn't get a copy, there are many hard copies on the way out, so please be sure to pick up a copy. It's very rich, and it does include quite a few footnotes, and it's quite a good read. So this morning we have the author of the report with us, Dr. Anders Åslund. To my left in the middle is Jock Mendoza-Wilson, and then to my left is Paul Thomas. And I'm very lucky to have a panel with an excellent economist, a businessman, and a lawyer. So I think we'll have a rich discussion here today. So I'm going to kick it over to Paul, who's an attorney based in Kiev.
Not an attorney.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Like a financial analyst.
A financial analyst. Can we kill that? Thank you. And he's going to outline. He's going to outline, give us just a structure of how to think of these assets, because this is a pretty complicated issue. So, Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay. I'm going to just very quickly sort of set a stage for Anders to talk at a high level with a lot of big numbers. We're talking about an enormously complicated situation here between Crimea and the Donbas. As you can see, the idea is to ultimately get some compensation. To do that, you have to put values on individual assets and companies, groups of assets, groups of companies, and we're talking now historical values as of, say, 2014 when they were seized, or 2015 when they were destroyed. And we're covering a really broad range of assets that I listed here: companies, real estate, cash, gas and oil reserves, coal reserves, even bank loans. I'm going to mention something about that very quickly. A lot, as Mr. Shymkiv mentioned, a vast amount of industrial property, plant, and equipment. When I threw this together, I forgot to mention, as an academic, it was a terrible oversight, universities. There were, just in the Donbas alone, there were 16 universities that were, confiscated, damaged, destroyed. This affected thousands of faculty and staff, tens of thousands of students who had to jump up and run away. They could not take with them their laboratories, their libraries, their records of past diplomas, records of current classes. Extremely disruptive to the lives of these folks. and extremely expensive. Universities are expensive to reproduce. Donetsk National University, they ended up in Vinica operating out of an old jewelry factory. Lugansk National University jumped, across the border to a small town, but they're obviously not operating under the best circumstances. So I don't know how you necessarily put a value on these, call them cultural assets, but the values are very huge. If we look over at the types of entities that are affected, Mr. Shymkiv talked a lot about, the large private enterprises and of course large state-owned enterprises. And as much as we care about those, we do have to also recognize that you have banks, both private and state, that were confiscated, damaged, destroyed, closed. You have a vast number of small and medium private enterprises that also suffered. And my favorite category, because not enough attention gets paid to that, is individuals and families. There were hundreds of thousands of apartments that were damaged, destroyed, stolen, because people had to jump and run away from them. There was cash on deposit in banks that families lost. There was a vast number of automobiles that were left behind, stolen, damaged, destroyed. A typical family, whether it's in America or Ukraine, the main asset of a family is its apartment or its house. And even if your apartment is fully intact, you're still looking at, in the Donbas, up to probably 80% would be my guess as an appraiser, 80% reduction in the value of a typical apartment, if you could sell it, if you could control the money once you did sell it. In Crimea, I would think residential property values would be declining at least 50%. So these, and my open rhetorical question is, how do we compensate the families for the loss of these assets? So I'm going to very quickly just show one more slide, because it's didn't get mentioned. We have to recognize that we have everything ranging from the actions of a recognized government, Russia, okay, that range from, again, the actions of a recognized government all the way to just pure banditry and everything in between. And my two favorite examples, the National Bank of Ukraine had $400 million US equivalent in cash in storage in Crimea, which was simply stolen. Now that's not bad for a day's work. That's a lot of money, okay? And in the Donbas, Naftogaz Ukraine, NOK, the national gas company, they had 400 million cubic feet of gas in storage in the Donbas, worth about $200 million, and it was simply stolen. So how does one compensate? Because to compensate, somebody has to agree to be the compensator, but since we have no idea, who stole the cash, who stole the gas, well, there you have it. I'm gonna leave it there, so because I want to listen to Anders.
Well, Anders did us the favor of putting a price tag on the losses, and we'll get to that later in our discussion. But Anders, one of the main points of your report is that Russia annexed and then nationalized Crimea and then invaded the Donbas, and these different types of military aggression have led to different types of governance and different types of losses. What kinds of losses did the Crimea experience, and what happened to private business after annexation?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for being here today. I was very happy to hear Dmytro Shymkiv's very detailed discussion, and I'm happy to see that the government has so much control of it. And I also like Paul's presentation here, what he did not show. So what I would like to try to do now is to give you the overall picture. And I'll start with this. How are these two territories ruled? And it's completely different. Crimea is today run as a normal part of Russia. It's fully integrated. There are Russian salaries, there are Russian pensions, admittedly not Russian prices, a bit higher because of big transportation costs, because of the sanctions. But this means, with regard to annexation, there's full Russian government responsibility. If something has been stolen from you in Crimea, it has been done through Russian legal nationalization. By legal, I mean that it's done by law or by decree. It is not that just somebody has taken it, as Paul mentioned here. Donbas, yeah, and probably 20,000 people have left Crimea and 20,000 gone there, of a population just over 2 million people. This is an authoritarian state, but perhaps 20 people have disappeared, been killed. It's not violent. In Donbas, occupied Donbas, it's completely different. This is in particular Lugansk, is a hellhole. Without any law and order, killings, extralegal killings of any kind. Bandits are taking apartments. They took out the whole banking system early on. About half the population have left. We don't really know how many people who live there, but probably 2.5 million, and it was almost twice as many to begin with. 1.7 million people displaced people in Ukraine. The Russians use two numbers, 500,000 or 1 million, depending on when people have left, and 100,000 to 200,000 people have gone to third countries. And therefore there's nobody who's responsible. Nobody recognizes Donetsk People's Republic or Lugansk People's Republic. Therefore there's nobody to claim anything from. And if these entities nationalize anything by decree, this is an illegal act. So therefore we are seeing much better documentation on what has been done for Crimea, because there it is clear whom you can claim it from. So I think that it's quite important for the future that a similar documentation is being done for Donbas, and I think that Jock here has it better than anybody else. Then we come to how much are these assets worth? And Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, attracted enormous attention when it came out 3 years ago. And he has a very convenient number. The average value in Europe of capital or assets in relation to GDP during the last 140 years in Europe has been 400%. And my suggestion then is that we apply that to Ukraine. Ukraine, before it started in 2013, had a GDP, according to the IMF, of $180 billion. But these two occupied territories amounted to Crimea, 3.7% of Ukraine's GDP, occupied Donbas, 10%. We add it, we get almost 14%, times $180 billion, times 4, and we get a total value of 100 billion. With $27 billion for Crimea and $37 billion for Donbas. This is, of course, not specifying what specifically is in this. For Crimea, we can say quite clearly, the big value is oil and gas reserves. Mm-hmm. And the oil and gas reserves, when the prices were high, were assessed at $30 to $40 billion. Mm-hmm. So that would be more than anything else in terms of value. The easiest thing to assess is the banks, because there you have money, you have cash, so you can see how much it was. $1.8 billion for Crimea. You heard here Dmytro Shymkiv mentioned $4.4 billion in the banks in Donbas. Then we have agriculture. It's rather easy to assess also. In Crimea, there was 1.4 million hectares of agricultural land. The current average price on the market which exists is 1,300. If we instead look up on the prices for neighboring countries, the similar level of economic development, Lithuania, Romania, it's rather 4,000. So here, either with a lower, it would be $1.8 billion for Crimea, or 5.6 billion for with a higher price, which I think that one should use. And add to this buildings, easily a couple of billions for Crimea alone, and infrastructure, also a couple of billions. So here it adds up, and we'll come to this, I guess, in the second sessions on the current claims. So Naftagaz is now claiming $7 billion in damages from Russia for the confiscation of all their assets in Crimea. And we are seeing a large number of cases being brought up in the International Arbitration Court in The Hague, and this is based on the bilateral investment treaty between Russia and Ukraine of 1998. So here there is a legal base. People can turn to it. Well, for Donbas, we don't have the numbers well put together. We don't have a country, a sovereign that can be claimed. And therefore also there's no legal base, which makes it much more difficult. So what the Ukrainian government has tried is to bring it up in the International Court of Justice under UN conventions, particularly terrorist financing. But this makes it much more difficult, and I would be interested to hear from Jock what legal avenues that you see are being open.
Anders, you threw out a lot of figures. What's the bottom line price tag? Is it 27 billion and 37 billion?
$73 billion for Donbas, $27 billion for Crimea. That's adjusted using the Piketty, but if you would try to do it more carefully, you would get a higher number for Crimea,
okay,
for a number of reasons, and you would get, in particular, the oil and gas. And Donbas, then you would have to ask what is the value of old factories, some of them that are quite run down.
Okay, so you're looking at least 100 billion as a minimum.
No, I look upon 100 billion as a reasonable number.
Okay, very good. And do you agree with that figure?
I do, probably as a minimum. You can put a value on assets, damaged, destroyed, stolen, abandoned, cannibalized. We've had all of the above. But those are assets. If you switch over and start looking at companies, and you say, well, what is the value of some of these companies that were nationalized in Crimea? Well, you now have to look at the forecasted future net cash flow that would accrue to the owners, whether that's private or state, from operating that company. And so you start with the value of the assets today, but when you start adding in legitimate, scientifically determined, reproducible results at the future value of companies, all that lost revenue to the owners or lost taxation to the government, suddenly these numbers become many times bigger. And so that's why I said I agree with Anders' number, and it's probably a minimum.
Great. Now, we know that the damage in the Donbas is far worse than what Crimea sustained. Let's bring Jock into the conversation. Jock has been on the ground. Jock, can you tell us a little bit more about the DTEC experience, the Meditech experience? How much have you lost as a result of the war?
Well, before the war, our assets were in the east of Ukraine, and they were on both sides of what is now the contact line. As a result of the conflict from 2014 through to the seizure of the assets in March last year, we would say we've lost 23 businesses that were on the other side of the contact line, that were seized by the Russian-backed separatists. In terms of our biggest businesses, we've got Metinvest, which is a metals and mining business, and Dmytro Shymkiv mentioned two of them in his presentation, in fact. So Metinvest lost three major businesses. They lost the Unikiva steel plant, they lost Krasnodon Ugol coal mine in Lugansk, and they lost Hartzi's tube and pipe plant, which was the most modern pipe producer using German technology. So those three businesses, we have made an impairment in our accounts last year for $516 million for the loss of those assets. As Paul says, that's the loss of the asset. They were very profitable businesses before the conflict began. The real loss of the business is much larger, in truth, in terms of future anticipated expected income. But nonetheless, that's a figure we can put on it. If we look at DTEC lost 11 assets in both from the period of the conflict and in March last year with asset seizure, and that was like 3 coal mining businesses, a thermal power plant, 1 combined power and heating plant, 3 electricity distribution companies, and 3 service companies that serviced our businesses. And there you're talking about losing asset value of about 15.5 billion hryvnias for those 11 businesses. You know, if you look at our businesses overall, before the conflict began, and even up until March last year, when the major seizures of assets took place, we had 60,000 employees working on the other side of the contact line for businesses that were Ukrainian-owned, earning export revenue for Ukraine, earning taxation revenue for Ukraine, and employing people and keeping them connected with Ukraine, even although they were working on the other side of the contact line. And those jobs have gone. And our best estimation is that approximately and declining, 50% of those jobs remained as jobs with the assets which were taken over. But at the time which they're taken over, the salaries were immediately devalued to 50%, well, because they changed the payment in hryvnia to payment in rubles. So effective devaluation of 50% across the board in everyone's salary. That's a huge impact on the regional economy in the non-occupied territories. But worse than that, you then have the movement towards Soviet-style management, which means that people are paid when cash is available and are paid in cash, so significant salary arrears. And our own belief is that when we invested billions of dollars in those businesses over our ownership, you can't run coal mines, you can't run sophisticated steel plants to their capacities and successfully and efficiently unless you continue to invest. And we know that the regimes that are on the other side of the contact line are it's really a case of their criminal kleptocratic regimes. They're not investing. They're simply seeking to take as much cash out as was outlined in Mr. Shymkiv's presentation, which I must say was very good. They're just taking cash out. Their idea is not to maintain the situation in those territories or maintain those assets, but to shift cash quickly from those assets to themselves in some shape or form. And absolutely, we believe, although it's hard to prove, that the ownership lies in Russia using an intermediary in South Ossetia, which is Vneshtorg Service. Now that is the business which seems to be at the core of the revenue streams and ownership questions. And that is an intermediary to Russia. Why? Because South Ossetia has the only connected banking system with the occupied territories, which then connects to the banking and financial system in Russia.
And this is a state-owned entity? National Service?
It may well be state-owned. The understanding is that individuals may well lie behind it. But, you know, proof is, regrettably, on the other side of the contact line, proof is in damn short supply.
Yes, yes, very much so.
And so there is much rumor and conjecture. But when Anders was saying, how do you pin down what's actually happening? It's extremely difficult, and you rely on informal, attained information to try and create a mosaic. You can't have a clear picture, but you can take a piece of information and try to create a mosaic of what's going on, which is what we try to do to defend our interests on the other side as to what has happened to our assets and where the money is going and where the cargoes are going.
Can I follow up here? The Ukrainian narrative is that it's eloped young oligarch Sergei Kurchenko who's taken over much of your assets. Do you think so?
That is the common story. But again, actually no firm information to be able to back that up. Regrettably, we don't know. But that is the common wisdom, would be the best way of describing it, Anders, without claiming that it's fact, but it seems to be strongly rumored.
Jock, where might DTEC pursue claims, and on what basis would you pursue them?
Well, all of our business will pursue claims that have lost assets. Well, I'll take an example of DTEC, which is a good one to bring up because it's coal. Before the conflict and before the seizure of assets, we're producing about 8 million tons of coal in the occupied territories. And there are a number of things you can do. The first thing is you can't give a signature for an individual mine of the coal produced, but you can give a signature of the region where it's produced because of the sulfur content. And the sulfur content of the coal produced, the anthracite coal produced in that area of Lugansk, where most of that 8 million was produced, is different from the sulfur footprint of coal produced in Russian coal fields. On the other hand, so that's one element, and we do follow that and explain that to people. Now, very importantly, we have also registered the thefts under the Ukrainian Criminal Code. Investigations are underway. You have to do that to have a basis for legal actions in other countries or against those who have stolen your assets. You have to have had it stolen in some way. So we have legal cases registered that natural resources have been stolen from Ukraine, and that's the beginning. The next stage that we took was we wrote much of the coal that is expropriated from Donbas and moved across the contact line to Russia is sold to Mediterranean ports, Mediterranean Black Sea ports, in fact, with coal traders based in that area. So there were 30 recognized coal traders who were likely to be recipients or transactors of our cargoes. So we wrote to all of those 30, explaining to them of the risk of taking stolen, misappropriated cargoes. That was necessary because there needs to be malicious intent if you're going to be able to take legal action. So you have to explain to them they have a risk, and therefore if they fail to take note of that risk, there is a malicious intent. So we did that. Much of the coal, the majority, I'm just going to refer to my figures here actually. We've got figures from March to November that, believe it or not, the European Union countries, 537,000 tons went to EU countries, which has sanctions against Russia. The two offending countries in this case, let's name and shame Poland and Romania. The non-EU cargoes, the largest offender was Turkey, which is a major coal trader in the region. And Turkey accounted for what we estimate to be 953,000 tons of coal. So in total, between March and November, we saw about 1.7 million tons of coal, illegal coal, from Donetsk being sold internationally, with Turkey and Poland up there as the major offenders. We took action in coordination with the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine to speak to their embassies and then to speak directly with the countries themselves to explain the dangers and the risks of this. The Poles did act promptly with this regard, but nonetheless, coal still seeps from Ukraine to other countries illegally, and we do as much as we can to create a legal threat and possibility of base of legal action against those who misappropriate our assets, and we will do so if we can, and we can find a legal territory where we can litigate, because it is absolutely pointless to litigate in Russia. We're not going to get the support of the courts, even if the action took place in that territory. So consequently, we have to find other territories, other possibilities for legal action. I'd love to be clearer, but it's a complex process, but we're taking every step we can to defend our assets and the assets of Ukraine.
Great, thank you, Jock. Anders and Paul, I have a question for you. Is there a registry to catalog damaged and destroyed property? And if not, who should be in charge of such a registry?
To my knowledge, there is none. There are lists, but there's not a clear registry. I think that the private people who have lost property are quite good at registering it, but it's not centralized anywhere. We are seeing a large number of cases that are brought up against Russia in The Hague, and normally then it's a number of Western companies that are, Ukrainian companies that are coming together to share the rather large cost for international arbitration. So you get 6 to 8 companies coming together, and but what is missing there is the state assets. So I think that it's the Ukrainian state that should really set up asset registries and clarify that.
Should it be within the MFA, or what's the appropriate Ukrainian body?
I would presume that it would be the Ministry of Justice, but that they should have a property registries generally.
Well, and even if you have a registry, you know, the ability of SCM or our client, we were working with Ukernafta, valuing their stolen gas stations in Crimea. The ability of large private enterprises, large state enterprises, to pursue legal restitution and compensation, that's one thing. But for, you know, 1.5 million internally displaced people who lost hundreds of thousands of flats and automobiles and cash in the bank, even if they're on a registry, who's going to represent them? Who's going to bear the cost and the burden to represent them? How are they going to be compensated? Who is going to compensate them? This brings us to this fascinating difference between Crimea and the Donbas. In Crimea, the Russian government has a very well organized, I would say nefarious, but it's a very well organized plan. And you'll notice there's not a lot of cannibalization that's going on there. You don't have companies being just operated into the ground. Yeah. The cash is going out. You don't have companies being disassembled and removed because the Russians have a plan. And in the Donbas, as Jock mentioned, you not only have companies where there's no investment, they're operating them, you know, like riding a dead horse, right? Just ride the horse till it dies, get the cash out. But then certain companies like Topaz, which Dmytro Shymkiv mentioned, a producer of military equipment, that facility was worth at least a few $100 million when it was operating, $300, $400, $500 million. It was a very, very valuable asset. And rather than operating that to nothing, they just disassembled it. They just literally cannibalized it and moved all the valuable assets back to Russia. So you see the Donbas literally like eating itself and just disintegrating, whereas in Crimea you see an organized attempt to you know, change the ownership. You could call it nationalization, confiscation, whatever. But you see an organized attempt to bring Crimea in whole as a valuable asset to be part of the Russian Federation, and you don't see that in the Donbas. And Donbas is truly a living hell now. The other thing that we have to point to for compensation issues, you know, business is integrated. You have supply chains, and you can have an asset in the Donbas, whatever happens to it. It's nationalized, confiscated, stolen, destroyed, but it has knock-on effects down that supply chain throughout Ukraine or elsewhere in the world, because you're dependent on something coming from the Donbas to come to you, and you add value and you pass it on. And those are very real and very large losses that are adding up too. Extremely hard to put a value on because they're indirect, but nonetheless.
Let me elaborate on this. In certain areas, there was a complete break in Crimea, banking specifically, and the oil and gas business, which was just taken over. So by end of April 2014, Ukrainian banking is finished in Crimea. But in most other areas, people had a choice. Do you want to register as a Russian company or not? So Dmytro Shymkiv mentioned here the two big factories on Crimea, Krim Soda and Krim Titan. To my knowledge, both these factories belong still to Dmitry Firtash, who has registered them as Russian companies. That's newspaper information, not verified, but I think it's correct. So they are continuing to operate as before. The big problem is that Crimea is subject to very severe Western sanctions. So shipping from Crimea outside of Russia declined by 90%. 90% in a year. And I think that this is still down, and that limits the activities. There is a market for enterprises and for houses. So you can just look up online and you see that prices are pretty flat. They are not collapsing, slightly lower than they were before. So the market continues. Crimea is relatively normal, while I would be very surprised to hear anybody who has bought anything in Donbas, occupied Donbas.
I want to jump in very quickly because of the banking example. The Russian government in Crimea, this is organized, it's pretty destructive. The Russian government passed a special law for Crimea that canceled all bank loans that were owed to the Ukrainian State Savings Bank, Åslund Bank, or that were owned to Privat Bank, which, as the name implies, was Privat. and they just canceled the loans. This cost Åslund Bank at least $1 billion in losses, and it caused Privat Bank at least about $2.5 billion in losses from the loans just being canceled. That was individuals, including a lot of high government officials who in Crimea, who were business people, who had large loans that they had organized with Åslund Bank and with Privat Bank. So they had a personal incentive to, leave the country because they themselves were canceling large amounts of debt to their personal benefit. But that's an interesting sort of example of how Russia's kind of striking back at Ukraine.
Gotcha. And my favorite example here is Ilya Konstantinov, the chairman of the parliament in Crimea. Yes. He happened to have loans to Ukrainian banks of $100 million. Yes. And from them, and he was then granted amnesty from this terrible burden.
Yeah, right, and he was very happy to help organize
the legislation
for the benefit of the Crimean people.
He was one of the three major people. I happened to sit. He came and sat down at the table with me in Yalta in September 2013, and my wife, who's rather sensitive about such things, said, "How can you sit with such a gangster?" and moved away.
Anders, I want to ask you one last question, then we're going to bring in the audience. You've talked about the material losses of the Donbas and Crimea. Can you talk about the larger economic picture? How much FDI has Ukraine lost as a result of the war, and how much has Ukraine lost as a result of sanctions, as a result of Russian sanctions?
Yeah, thank you. Altogether, Ukrainian GDP has fallen by 17% in 2014-2015, and this is entirely because of a war. So you can say here is 40% of GDP that disappears because it's no longer in the country. And on top of that, FDI used to be 4-5% of GDP. Now it has been 1-2% of GDP. And say that it's 3% of GDP each year that disappears because of FDI not coming into a country that is in war. And then we have trade sanctions. So from 2012 to 2016, 80% of the trade with Russia, both imports and exports, have disappeared. So the trade sanctions from Russia that started in July 2013 have been vicious. The first three people who were sanctioned by the Russians were Petro Poroshenko, Viktor Pinchuk, and Sergei Taruta. Of course, it was not formulated like that, but chocolate and steel pipes. And in this way, they got hit. And then it has been more and more categories that have been sanctioned by Russia. Ukraine, on the other hand, had previously 34% of its exports to Russia. In 2012 was machinery, read armament. So almost all this was armament, a little bit of railway equipment. But this was helicopter engines, airplane engines, airplanes, many parts from Kharkiv for these air defense system S-300 and S-400, and long distance rockets from Dnipropetrovsk, Kuchma's old Yuzhmash factory. So it's Ukrainian rockets that take US astronauts to the International Space Station.
Great, thank you. We have microphones. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Please tell us your name. And please use a question mark, not a statement. Do we have any questions? George in the front, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for very, very interesting presentations, and it's obviously extremely important. I think you know, the whole issue of reparations has been neglected, yeah. And it's time for it to get cranked up. I'm very pleased to hear, in contrast to kind of the numbers I was hearing 2 years ago, some increasingly realistic valuations and assessments of the losses. I remember 2 years ago, I think it was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, put out a booklet that was cataloging losses based on, as I understand it, depreciated original cost book value. Mm. I mean, that was embarrassing, and it was also compromising to any future litigation because it would be used as an admission of some adverse factual circumstance. But I think, I'll try to put this in as a question. What is being done to really fine-tune, polish, and make more complete and accurate the valuation of these losses? I think we're doing much better, and some of the numbers I've heard I think are much better. But I still feel that there's an awful lot more to be included. For example, I think somebody mentioned, you know, the future value of earnings. You know, you have the future value, you've got the hard asset, but what about the future value of the benefits of that hard asset? That needs to be capitalized. Those future benefits need to be capitalized. And not just of companies and production facilities, but also for lots of other things like roads, infrastructure. Infrastructure carries with it future benefits that need to be valued and capitalized. If you don't have a road, you don't have any commerce. If you put in a road, then you have communication, you have commerce, you have economic activity, and all that carries an economic value that needs to be capitalized. Similarly, I think you get into more complicated things like I think capitalizing putting a number on and capitalizing the value of things like human beings. I mean, you know, there's 10,000 human beings that were lost. There's 1.5 million people who've been displaced. What's the economic value of that? Mm. And is it compensable? I think it is. I was glad to hear the mention of universities, healthcare institutions. Those carry very significant future values that have been destroyed and need to be now recognized, capitalized, and added to the list. So, Melinda, to put it as a question, is anybody working on this? I'm sure Jock Mendoza and his folks are working on that which, you know, particularly touches them. But in a broader sense, is there any effort to really gather all these valuations and really come up with realistic numbers? Even something like, you know, my big bugaboo is the gas in the Black Sea, that I've not heard anybody really put a realistic value on it. Shymkiv said 1.6 trillion cubic meters. Well, how much is a 1.6 trillion cubic meters worth? At 50 cents a cubic meter, that's $800 billion.
Great, thank you.
To the best of my knowledge, the Ukrainian government does not have an organized approach to fully document and value according to international valuation standards, so that the valuations can, you know, withstand scrutiny. They don't have a program to do that. They need, not only do they need to do that, they need to do that in a hurry, because I've had experience valuing assets that were seized by, you know, say Russian banks and the like. And you're always doing historical valuations.
Yeah.
And you know, we're now 4 years into this, and the longer you wait, even if you have two, you know, very friendly entities that agree that they're going to compensate, it gets harder and harder and harder to agree on a value that's based on data from 4 years or 5 years ago. And I would recommend that the Ukrainian government start with Crimea, because, you know, in Crimea we have a recognized government that is responsible and fully admits that they are responsible for the annexation of Crimea, and you still have mostly uncannibalized. Okay, Russia took Crimea with the intention that it will be a valuable part of the Russian Federation. So you have information that still exists, unlike in the Donbas where records are destroyed. You have the companies operating. Now, you're not going to get cooperation. Okay, we have figured out ways in our firm how to value assets, even though you cannot get direct access to them. All right, there are ways, I won't go into it, but there are lots of ways in which you can get valuable numbers. And I would recommend the Ukrainian government put together a task force of, you know, credible appraisers and start in Crimea, because we can develop, you know, defensible numbers there. The Donbas, I don't know. The Donbas is a catastrophic situation. A lot of what's there can be valued. I mean, the companies that of System Capital Management, they can be valued in terms of the business value, the asset value. But I would start with Crimea because it's actually easier. Yeah. Okay. Now, you mentioned realistic numbers. There are realistic numbers for the value of the oil and gas reserves in Crimea that were seized. It's 40 billion is a good number. Now someone will say, yeah, but that was 40 billion based on 2014, not today. The price is lower. But whoa. If I steal a car today worth $50,000, and then 4 years from now I agree to compensate, I can't say, well, I'm only going to compensate you 5,000 because I put a lot of miles on there. Okay, didn't change the oil. So it is the value as of the date that it was, you know, stolen, destroyed, nationalized, whatever term you want to use. And again, we have to hurry, because when, you know, as time goes on, it's going to be harder and harder to do. Okay, and I personally think that eventually some kind of compensation agreement. It may have to wait some years, maybe a new government, who knows, but at some point I think there can be some compensation agreement made between Ukraine and Russia concerning Crimea. The Donbas, who do you hold responsible?
Yeah.
That's the problem.
We're going to discuss that in panel 2.
Sorry.
Anders wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, thank you very much, George and Paul. I have here as the first recommendation, Ukraine's government should establish full and detailed inventories of all assets Ukrainian entities have lost in Crimea and the Donbas and realistically assess the value. And I have drawn up here the cases I could find that have been brought by Ukrainian parties in the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague against the Russian Federation. And it's 7 different cases. Each is a group of companies. And these groups, 2 of them are essentially real estate companies that want to make the claims. One is Nafta and Naftagaz companies. Another is Oshad Bank, a state company, but otherwise most of them are private. So who is lagging behind here is of course the Ukrainian state, as you could guess, while the companies are much more at it. I should say that 2 of these groups are led by Igor Kolomoisky, so he's very good at litigation.
Okay, we had a question here. Oh, are you finished? Question here, please.
Core competency of his business.
Elaine Serrero, Associate Rector for Ukrainian American Concordia University in Kiev, Ukraine. And I really appreciate the broad presentation. Obviously, the topic was on the corporations and the reclaiming of the values of these corporations, both in Crimea and in Donbas, but also the overarching talk about the other infrastructure issues, the educational infrastructure issues, the health infrastructure issues, the society of people. And I'd like to ask you, with regard to legal precedents, which may, how would the fact that recently in the Netherlands, because of the patrimony issues regarding cultural issues taken from assets that are being taken from Crimea and looted and sent to Russia. This is cultural artifacts that are being taken out of Crimea, and the precedence is the pieces that were prior to the invasion of Crimea. There were a large collection from the Crimean museums in the East touring, and Russia wanted those pieces to go back to Crimea to be then sent to Russia. That was stopped. Can that be used as a current precedence for leveraging the values and properties that are also being looted from Crimea and Donbas and being sent to other places, including Russia?
Anyone want to take that, or should we let our lawyers discuss that in the next panel?
It sounds like a lawyer question.
Okay, we're going to defer that question.
I should add
Go ahead.
here that the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, Alyona Zerkal, is in charge of these international claims issues, and she is appearing all the time in the International Court of Justice. And I should say that this private arbitration court in The Hague has accepted jurisdiction. Russia, of course, does not accept this, but it doesn't really matter, because if there is a positive verdict in the court, then Ukraine can, the Ukrainian parties can collect this internationally from Russian government assets, including Russian state-owned companies, think Gazprom, internationally, which Yukos started doing until they got into trouble with the verdict.
Thank you. We're going to let our lawyers answer that one in the next panel. I have a question right here, please. Just wait for the microphone, please. And remember to tell us your name and ask a question, please.
Yaroslav Martinyuk, formerly with Radio Liberty. Andrew answered already part of the question, but assuming the International Court of Justice rules in favor of Ukraine and Russia refuses to pay, what is the recourse, to collect the damages? We all know that Russia has a lot of state assets and oligarchs have money in the banks. What are the chances of these being confiscated?
This is for the lawyers.
This is the next panel question. Please keep the legal questions for panel 2. We have great lawyers for you next time. These two gentlemen right here, let's take them together.
Good morning. My name is Paul Kervin. I'm retired deep government, State Department.
Deep state.
Mr. Shymkiv made the point that many of the largest, best operations of various industries in the world or in East Europe have lost any kind of management, administrative talent. Presumably this went west into Ukraine. Would an enterprising venture capitalist be able to put together a new business and capture all the expertise that now exists in the West? Can these businesses be reformatted with sufficient investment?
It's a big challenge. If I take that question first, I think that's a big challenge. When people went, even before the blockade, so from 2014 onwards, there was a steady hollowing out of talent in the occupied territories. And we felt that in our business, because that we were still operating on the other side of the contact line. And we knew that those who had skills and talents and abilities, many of them quickly gravitated to the other side of the contact line. And then they found new employment. And as you may or may not know, many Ukrainians, over 1 million now, work in Poland. So those people who were displaced have often found other employment. If they were at the highest level, they were able to find employment in other jobs. What is problematic going forward, and therefore their talents are either captured in the Ukrainian economy or have been lost, as they've either gone to Europe, to Poland, or in case of a large number, they went to Russia and took up employment there. So that high, readily deployable, very skilled workforce found employment. That's not the employment problem. The employment problem is as at those who are skilled workers. There is a problem, because the skills that they had in steel making, for example, or in coal mining, or in other, or in heavy engineering. Now, those skills are not required in most cases. Very few of those skills are required on the other side of the contact line. And that's when you see high levels of unemployment and poverty amongst citizens who are now IDPs and have moved from occupied Ukraine over into Ukraine. So I believe that the talent is being deployed in most cases, but the average worker, the skilled worker, he now has a set of skills, or she has a set of skills that are not deployable in the new Ukraine. And that is a huge challenge for Ukraine going forward, to try and find a way in which to reskill those workers and find productive employment for them. And also to encourage the investment, which you are right. I think there is a great opportunity for FDI in Ukraine, and particularly in the east. So there's a concern going forward that there will be an imbalance in investment, with investment moving, as it has been, to the center and west of Ukraine, with close and fast access to the European Union. But in the east, where there has been a hollowing out of the economy because of the conflict, unemployment is higher, but investment isn't coming into that area. And that's a concern for the economic future, I think, of the east of Ukraine.
Great, thank you. And there was a second question. There you are.
Thank you for your presentation. My name's Stephen Keenan. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this gentleman's name correctly, but you know who I'm. The man's name is Rimat Armatov, I think it might pronounce.
Renat Akhmetov. Yeah.
What? Thank you.
He's my boss.
That's why he pronounces the name correctly.
Yeah, I can
You get an A, Jock.
Yeah.
Okay, what's your question, please, sir?
Thank you. So what is he doing? And obviously he has a lot of interest in the Donbas, a lot of influence too. He certainly, as far as I've read and heard people talk, he certainly was trying to stop the war from happening. Where is he? What's he doing now? Thank you.
He's in Kiev running the business, or at least heading the business, and I see him regularly. You know, you're right. We worked very hard at the time in order to try and prevent and to sort of roll back the tide of the Russian invasion by deploying our workers, by organizing protests and so on. But we were not successful. We were there working very closely in partnership with the Ukrainian state. I know because I was doing some of those tasks and cooperating at the time with Governor Chiruta. Now we lost all those businesses that I was saying earlier. Now we look to continue to invest in Ukraine. We've retooled our supply lines. You were talking about supply lines earlier, to focus on government-controlled Ukraine. We still have the majority of our business, 80% of it, is inside government-controlled territory, and we continue to believe in the long-term future of the Ukrainian economy, and are investing somewhere in the region of $1 billion in doing so. And indeed, in Mariupol, a frontline city, we are in the process of completing a major investment in a new casting machine with the Austrian technology, investing just under $250 million into our steel plants there in order to increase and improve production. So, you know, we believe in a long-term commitment to Ukraine, and still we would like to, you know, we believe that in the future, if there is a negotiated peace process, that we will play an essential role in reconnecting Ukraine to the currently occupied Donbas. But that is a task that lies somewhere in the future ahead of us, at a time of which yet we're uncertain. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Great. This gentleman right here, please.
Hi, my name is Zanon Potishnik, the Ukraine Chamber of Commerce, and thank you very much for the presentations. Definitely quite interesting and obviously very, very important for Ukraine. One of our companies is actually in a joint investment agreement with Chornomor Naftogaz, and two of the properties were actually now affected by the illegal occupation of Crimea, because the Russians now consider the offshore projects close to Crimea as their territorial waters. But I want to come back to valuation on the oil and gas assets. Dr. Åslund, you mentioned 40 billion, and you mentioned 40 billion as sort of a number, which I don't know, I hear some numbers that are even higher than that. But strangely enough, Naftogaz of Ukraine, in their lawsuit against Russia, started with 5 billion, then has moved on to 7 billion, and then now I hear they added another one, so they're about 8 billion, which is, even if we take 40 as the number, 8 is very far from 40. Can you comment on that? Why such a huge difference, and how come it's not properly?
Oh, sure. There are two different things. If you take the that 8 billion, that is focused exclusively on physical assets. You know, drilling platforms, special towers that were built for offshore operation, related infrastructure. A market value of that would be about $5 billion, fair market value. And the Ukrainian government has now added 3 billion in interest. Well, that's going to be a hard number to defend. The balance sheet value, if you just take the balance sheet of Chornomor Naftogaz, it's 2.5 billion. Okay, but those are just physical assets. The 40 billion is just the value of oil and gas reserves in the ground, you know, based on a net price, you know, net of extraction cost. So the 40 billion is oil and gas reserves, and the 8 billion is physical assets plus some interest, and that's the difference. So you need to add the two together. So there's at least 45 billion, and then the interest, again, that's going to be a little hard to defend.
The origin of the number 40 billion is a statement by the then Minister of Energy in 2014. So that's why people tend to use that number. I don't know how well considered it is.
Do we?
Well, no, I just wanted to mention that, you know, I'm glad that we're mentioning humanitarian issues again.
Absolutely.
There has been a looting of cultural artifacts from Crimea, especially Scythian gold that's been taken out, moved off to the Hermitage. You know, the suits filed against some gold artifacts that were in, I believe, the Netherlands on a museum display that the Russians came after. There's been a decline in the number of foreign students coming to universities in Ukraine, because that tends to kind of, you know, the prospect of war scares you away. There has been a decline, as Anders mentioned, in foreign direct investment into Ukraine, because, you know, this kind of instability tends to spook students and their parents and investors. And, you know, again, those are, it's very hard to put a number on that for compensation. Last quick point, you know, the Ukrainian government itself has had to absorb, you know, for them, what are really huge costs in helping internally displaced persons with buying and renting flats. They have a special program to help subsidize folks, especially out of the Donbas, to buy and rent flats. And again, there's a lot of welfare services burdens that have been put on the government to take care of its citizens that have been displaced.
And yet housing remains a very, very vital issue. There's
Sure.
a huge shortage and the prices are sky high.
Sure.
And Jock can speak to that if we have time. But on your point I was glad you brought up National Donetsk University. And we've done quite a bit of reporting on the university. And what you say is true, that the number of foreign students did decline. But they are seeing the number of foreign students increasing again. So National Donetsk University reestablished itself in Vinica, and it's doing well and flourishing, and they're starting to see you know, the student interest coming back.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. You know, everything we're saying is kind of like negativity is a one-way street. Well, you know, negatives create positives. If you go down into Kherson Oblast on the Black Sea coast, especially Odessa Oblast, there's a huge booming new tourism industry there. And it's Ukrainian domestic investment, because everybody, you know, I don't know the numbers, but a large percentage of tourism that went to Crimea, of course, they were Ukrainian citizens. They don't go there. Well, where do they go? They're now coming to Odessa and Kherson. This is generating employment and a lot of investment, and a lot of it is purely Ukrainian domestic investment. That's quite good. And distance learning at universities has gotten a good sort of shot in the arm, because especially Lugansk naturally, they ended up with, they didn't have one campus. They're kind of scattered all over. So they've had to now rely less on the old person-to-person model of education, and they're now bringing in a lot of online education, distance learning. So, you know, Ukrainians, like everybody else in the world, they respond to adversity, and we are seeing some positive results. You know, I don't want to link, you know what I mean. But we are seeing the Ukrainian people, Ukrainian government respond to this adversity in their own positive way.
Absolutely. And the Atlantic Council last year did a report on Ukraine's IDPs. I'm one of its authors. My co-author is Dr. Lauren Van Meter. She's here. And the word we used over and over again was resilient. Ukraine's IDP community is resilient and impressive. We have time for one more question. I saw some hands. Could you give the microphone?
I saw an ambassador do this.
Oh, no, if we could get the microphone to this gentleman here, please.
Hello, Keith Smith from SEPA. This is a very impressive presentation, very impressive. And my question, I've been to Europe several times in the last year, and I find when I ask people in Europe about the effects of the takeover of Crimea and the war in the Donbas, they just they don't know anything about it in a lot of these large European, West European countries. And even some of the East European countries don't seem. My question is there a way of taking this roadshow and having it get all of the journalists and, you know, as many journalists you can in Paris and London and Rome and everybody listen to this, because this is essential that you get European support for this. And right now, I don't think it's that strong. And I think this is something that really needs to be done all over, certainly in the big capitals in Europe. Thank you.
I like London.
That's not a question. I realize.
There are
I
plans.
didn't ask a question. I guess I should say.
There are plans to do it, in fact, as we did last year with the humanitarian report that was written by my colleagues, and which I was part of at least presenting. There is also a plan to take this discussion of the losses in Crimea and Donbas and do this, I think, in London and Brussels.
June 29th, we're going to London.
For London, June 29th.
So it's in track, because we recognise. I mean, particularly me, I'm often going to Brussels and to London. That there is a deficit of knowledge amongst decision makers about the real cost that Ukraine has suffered as a result of this aggression.
But please invite the journalists.
Of course.
Absolutely, and we should say
happy to brief them.
We're doing a number of outreach. We're doing outreach with a number of Ukrainian journalists as well. So hopefully this report will get translated into Ukrainian and Russian, and we'll see some articles pop up in the next week or so.
American journalists.
We're working on it. We're on it. So the measure of a good moderator is to give you enough time to have coffee. So we're going to conclude. I'd like to thank you all. Oh, Anders, you get the last word.
Yeah, I just wanted to have as a last word, what I think is really important now is to get a full Ukrainian registry of all the losses. And I think this is particularly on the government side, but the private sector takes care of itself when it's enterprises, but we also have all the small people and we have a government.
Absolutely. And I think Paul's point on start with Crimea is well taken as well. So thank you all very much. We'll see you in about 20 minutes for the second panel.
Great.
Thank you.
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yeah.
Very good. I think this is...
That's my pro bono card.
Thank you, George. Thank you. Oh, fine, thank you.
Voice of America.
No, very good.
Can we do one question on camera?
Sure.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
this here, okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Or you just choosing right now?
Volunteer Mike. How's the first day as the big boss?
Exact same as the other days. Freaking Tom drive me nuts. Just had to send him that Arthur beam that's just like the fist, you know?
That I literally just posted that on my.
Did you?
On my
He was pissing me off.
I literally just posted that on my Snapchat.
It kind of just encapsulates everything.
I don't even know who this is. Who? Oh, Moritz.
Tom.
He's new. He's from Germany, so he probably.
Yeah, that's the crap. You didn't know about that, right? Her video? I did, but I was just waiting for her to send it to me. It was actually set up at 11:30 in the morning.
Maybe you want to double check out with him.
Oh, his number? Yeah, I'll fix it. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Talking out loud.
You saw her message, Chaz?
What did it say?
Chaz, please grab these. Okay. Oh, yeah, I'll bring it back.
I ain't get no message. Fuck.
Chaz, once this event starts, are you able to come get some beer and wine with me?
Huh?
So once this event starts,
I'll go get some beer and wine. I thought you said you was an alcoholic.
Not you.
That's exactly what I thought he was talking about. I was like, okay, Tom.
Early in the morning.
See what's going on here, buddy.
Oh, man. Man, Julie. Why ain't you telling I was out the office? Huh? Nah. What type of guy are you?
I do not work for you.
Yes, you do. I'm gonna tell Eileen.
Please, so she can tell you I don't.
We're gonna fire you.
Yeah, okay.
We work together, Cass.
Chaz, she directly sent you an email. Why would I tell her? And not to mention that the reason she sent you the email is because you told me to email her. You set yourself up.
Used to like, so having them just like put it in the hallway. So next time we need to like tell them we can't have them just like wander in the hallway. Yeah, because I still need to put the light back on there.
Я тебе могу сказать, что
set your things down and stuff like that. Do it right here, but we can just, I mean, if you want to just put your stuff right here, you actually won't want it on stage, so place this in your pocket. You can put that in any pocket, and then I'm just gonna clip this on there if that's okay.
Sweetie, I have to go into Canada. Sorry, son. I have to go.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, can I call you later? Can I call you later? Yeah, that's cool. That's very cool. Yes.
So we finally had it out with the lawyers. And you know what? The two of them got up and walked away from the meeting.
You heard like that the young Jewish lawyer, the son, goes to the father, who's also a lawyer, said, "Dad, I had my first case and I won the case in 2 hours." Says, "No, son, you have to. I have to still teach you a lot.
Yeah, for
not
sure, yeah.
quickly you win. How much you
hours
make?"
Yeah.
I mean, they're screaming, yelling at Lutsenko, at Poroshenko. It's the lawyers. The lawyers are left tonight to drag this stuff out, to look at more evidence, to do this stuff.
Yeah.
But you have to do it. I mean, you cannot skip this process.
I mean,
you have to go through this. And these cases, this whole portfolio of claims, when you put it all together and when they start being already decided, because right now, most of the arbitrations, they have decisions on the jurisdiction but not on the merit.
did such a good job that we have extremely high expectations to meet. But I think we've got a good shot of meeting them because this is really the meat of the subject. It's crystal clear that extraordinary amount of damage has been done by the Kremlin via its seizure of Crimea and its aggression in Donbas. The first panel gave us a pretty good idea as to what extent that damage might be. We've got some excellent people up here. You have their bios, so I will not describe them for you, to talk about how we might seek, how Ukraine might seek legal recompense. And we'll start with Dr. Alan Riley, who's done a great deal of work in this field. And Alan, I mean, you are a person who has extraordinary background in it, so I'll let you speak broadly about the legal recourses that might be available.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's nice to be here again at the Atlantic Council. What I would say is that I'm going to give you a kind of overview of the situation and some comments of where I think we might be able to go. And then I will leave my colleagues on the panel to go into a bit more detail. At one level, from a layman's perspective, you think, well, is this even law? What can you do? I mean, they've invaded the country. You can't sue in the Russian courts. How can you sue Vladimir Putin? It looks all complicated and difficult. At one level, of course, it is. If you look at the UKOS litigation, which was launched in about 2006 and is ongoing. So, I mean, these things can take a long time. However, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And there may well be shortcuts, which I'll come to that in a moment. I think there are for Ukraine, there are two major avenues. The first is the European Convention on Human Rights. And the reason for this is that, first of all, Ukraine and Russia are both members. They're bound by the provisions. The second is that you have got a whole series of provisions which clearly are applicable. Article 2, the right to life. Article 8, the right to home and family, which of course internally displaced people could rely on. Protocol 1, Article 1 of Protocol number 1 of the Convention, the right to property.
Excuse me, Alan, 1 minute. Can anyone hear you? Can everybody hear Alan?
Can you all hear me?
Maybe the air conditioning just went off. It might be a little.
Oh, shall I say that?
It was hard.
Yeah. Okay, right. Okay, well, just the air conditioning.
Speak up.
Well, so essentially, we have a series of codified provisions of the Convention which are directly applicable to the Ukrainian situation. Article 2, right to life, for example. Article 8, right to home and family. Article 1 of Protocol number 1, the right to property. So you have a series of provisions which are applicable here. The second thing is you have case law precedent because of the invasion of Cyprus, or northern Cyprus, by Turkey. And that resulted in a whole series of cases in which where all of these issues were already worked out. So the point about it is you've got a court to which Russia and Ukraine are subject. You've got a court procedure which is available. You've got legal provisions which are applicable, and you have got case law precedent. So that is one of the reasons why that is a very good court to use. That's one route in. And you can see particularly, say, for internally displaced people, for small businesses, whatever, you can see you could bring a series of claims in that court. Now, Anston has spent 2 Ukrainian cases which have already gone forward into that procedure, but you potentially could do more. But that then links back to what the earlier panel was saying, is we need to identify the losses, we need an international accounting board, we need to actually be able to identify this in some detail. But potentially, that is a route forward. Now, the major problem with that is that if we get a result, we get a judgment, we still have the problem of how on earth do we then enforce it. And I'll come back to that, but the essential point is that you can get a ruling. Of course, eventually the argument will be at some point there will be a settlement and we would get a result. The other route is via bilateral investment treaties, and particularly the bilateral investment treaty signed between Ukraine and Russia, and the potential for a large number of Ukrainian companies to be able to sue Russia under the Bilateral Investment Treaty. And as was mentioned in the last panel, I think there was about 7 cases already before the Hague Permanent Court of Arbitration. Now, the great advantage of that procedure, and this was brought up in a question, or suggested in a question from the floor after the last panel, was that there is a route to enforcement. And this is basically, once you have a ruling from an arbitration panel, you can register the ruling under the New York Convention and then enforce it as a judgment anywhere in the West. So in principle, you could then enforce those rulings and the damages attached to those rulings in any court in the West. So you would be able to enforce it against, for example, not just Russian directly state-owned assets, but those of Russian state-owned companies, and there are a lot of them. So Gazprom, Rosneft spring to mind. I mean, one of the things I just said to one of the Ukrainian reporters here is that, one could potentially seize the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines, which would have an additionally beneficial effect on Ukraine. So, this is one possibility. I mean, that's an interesting possibility at the moment, is the fact that actually Naftogaz has already got a ruling for $2.5 billion against Gazprom. And one of the options for Naftogaz today, because the ruling's already available, there's only a procedural appeal that Gazprom can make. On the substance, Ukraine has absolutely won. So the Naftogaz could take steps to register that judgment, register that ruling as a judgment in the New York Convention, and then seek to enforce it in the German courts against all Gazprom state-owned assets, all Gazprom assets in Germany, their storage facilities, their ownership of pipelines, the Nord Stream pipelines in German territorial waters. So this is the sort of thing that you'll potentially be able to do. So that gives you some sense of how this can work. Now, of course, the timelines can be significant, but that is really interesting. Now, I want to finish with one other point, and it is this, that because of the shift in public opinion in the West, as it's clear that Russia has interfered in elections and referenda across the Western democracies, and the interference, the level of concern and potential willingness to take more action against Russia opens up other possibilities. And one possibility which I think is interesting, based, I think, perhaps on the United Nations Compensation Commission for Kuwait after the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, is whether or not we can create an international compensation commission where if you get a ruling in the ECHR or if you get a ruling from an arbitration panel, you will be able to bring it before that international compensation commission. And the really interesting thing will be to say the International Compensation Commission will be for any claims, again, which are from the Russian gangster mafia state, where anybody has been affected. So that would be Georgians, potentially, Ukrainians, British citizens who have been poisoned in Salisbury. And I think that is something which is worth thinking about. I don't think we're necessarily there, but I think we may well end up there in creating an international compensation commission to deal with the damage caused by Vladimir Putin's regime. And with that point, I'll stop.
Alan, that was wonderful. You've also set up perfectly Irina's contribution. I understand you know a great deal about the Bilateral Investment Treaty and how this might be used by Ukraine. Please.
Thank you, John. Before I move to Bilateral Investment Treaty, I just wanted to make a couple of comments on European Court of Human Rights, because those are the smaller claims, and any private citizen can apply. The first comment is that first the claimants have to exhaust the national mechanism, the national justice system. So it means that those claimants have to go either to Ukrainian courts or to Russian courts, go all the way through the national system, probably either get a judgment, or if they go into through the Russian legal system, they will lose the case, but which is good, because then they go to the European Court of Human Rights, and there they file a claim. And the second is that European Court of Human Rights is very conservative in compensation. So for bigger companies, and that brings me to the Bilateral Investment Treaty, for companies which incurred major losses, it's much better to use the mechanism of Bilateral Investment Treaty because they really want to get the compensation of their massive losses. And the Bilateral Investment Treaty between Russia and Ukraine has been in existence since 1998. It took effect in 2000. And this Bilateral Investment Treaty prohibits expropriation in general, allows it only in exceptional cases, and demands an immediate and adequate compensation. So there is a very solid sort of, standard provision in this Bilateral Investment Treaty. And the Ukrainian investors in Crimea and in Donbas as well, when those territories became occupied, they involuntarily became Ukrainian investors in the territories occupied and controlled, effectively controlled by the Russian Federation. So they have a cause of action under the Bilateral Investment Treaty. We were talking a lot here in the first panel also about damages. And the Bilateral Investment Treaty very helpfully provides a formula for damages in such cases. And the Bilateral Investment Treaty talks about the market value at the moment of expropriation plus the LIBOR interest plus 1%. So
what was the third point?
LIBOR interest plus 1%.
Oh, plus 1%.
Yes. So this formula is the only formula that can be used under Bilateral Investment Treaty claims. And there are, of course, experts in damages, and Paul was at the first panel, they're called quantum experts, and they are evaluating in each particular case under this formula what are the damages in each particular case. There are now 7 cases brought under Bilateral Investment Treaty. 6 of them are brought under administration of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. 1 case, Åslund Bank, is brought in Swedish Chamber of Commerce, in Stockholm Chamber of Commerce. And I want to make sure that we understand the difference when, we generally talk about claims of Ukraine against the Russian Federation. There are different categories of claims and different institutions that are dealing with these claims. Bilateral Investment Treaty deals only with investors. So those are companies. This is not the state of Ukraine. Those are companies that go against the Russian Federation into this Permanent Court of Arbitration or Stockholm Chamber of Commerce, and they file their individual cases. Each time a arbitration tribunal is created, and the proceedings are confidential. So unfortunately, we will not find out from public sources, what really happens. We will know the award is in favor of Ukrainian companies or not, but the awards are not published. There are no precedents. The precedents don't really work in international arbitration. So there are 7 different tribunals. And in one case, they can decide in favor of the claimant, and in the other case, they may decide not in favor of the claimant. So the circumstances can be the same, but or arbitral awards can be different. But I think these 7 arbitrations should be followed very, very closely in any case, and they are all at the initial stages. They all, I think, in all 7 cases, the tribunals recognize their jurisdiction, which is very good development. And then they start reviewing cases by the merits. And Russian Federation in all 7 cases refused to participate, which doesn't mean anything because if the tribunal recognizes their jurisdiction, they have full capacity and right to issue an award on the merits, and this award will be enforceable anywhere in the world. Not anywhere, but in the countries which signed the Arbitration Convention, New York Arbitration Convention, and that's the majority of countries of the world. So that's not the question of whether those awards will be enforced. They will be enforced eventually. The question is how soon we will approach this point. and also, how each individual arbitral tribunal will decide, and that's, something that we should be watching. Now, there are many, many, many more claimants, potential claimants, that have not applied yet. I think that it's a very expensive endeavor. You need to have global law firms, you need to have quantum experts. So I think some of the potential claimants, they are looking at those 7 first cases, and if they see potential, I think they will probably consolidate and will start also applying. And the last point that I wanted to make, that when Crimea was occupied, and under Ukrainian law, it happened on the 20th of February 2014. That's the start of the occupation. There were 2 waves of expropriation. The first wave was so-called, strategic wave, and that happened. That started happening almost immediately, in fact, but it was legally formalized by the illegal Crimean authorities adopting unlawful acts on nationalization, and this was with regards to the energy assets and with regards to the seaports and sea infrastructure. And those were adopted around 17th of March and later. This was a lasting sort of process. And then the second wave was caused by the corridor, which I called nationalization corridor, which was created by the Russian law. You may know that the Russian Federation, when they annexed Crimea, they allowed Ukrainian companies to re-register and become Russian companies. So, this way they wanted to prevent the claims, exactly what we're talking about, that they become the Russian companies and then, they continue functioning. But they made an exception from this provision, and they said that every company in Crimea can re-register except for the companies that were created by the state of Ukraine or owned by the state of Ukraine. Or municipals, in this broader definition, municipal companies as well. Even if there is some participation of Ukrainian state ownership, those companies could not re-register. So they put them basically outside of the internal Russian law protection, thinking that, they are in no man's land, basically, those companies. And then, using this nationalization corridor, the Crimean authorities, after annexation, they adopted the nationalization resolution, and they carried out massive expropriation of what they thought were the Crimean companies with Ukrainian state ownership, plus the so-called ownerless companies, which they said were abandoned by their owners. They got into this corridor as well. So then this corridor was closed after, in fact, all of them were expropriated. This corridor was closed, and the Russians said now they can re-register on 4th of November, when everything was taken from them. So the Russians thought that this way they are protecting internally themselves from claims from these companies. But they didn't take into account that by remaining Ukrainian companies, by not re-registering, because they could not, by remaining Ukrainian companies, these companies were protected by the Bilateral Investment Treaty. Mm-hmm. So they basically shoot themselves in the foot. And now these companies are, or have filed those bilateral investment claims.
But since presumably this includes the Naftahaz affiliate,
yes, of course, all of them, yeah.
That was arguably, if you count the hydrocarbon reserves, the most valuable property in Crimea.
Yes.
So there was a certain amount of greed behind this decision too, probably.
Yes, but those actually, Naftagaz, and they were expropriated before the corridor was created. Oh, they were the first, the strategic nationalization, expropriation, and those were all the rest of them.
Okay, very, very interesting. Eugene, I know you've done some serious look at the plight of IDPs who've suffered as a result of the invasion of Donbas. What is the legal recourse for them?
John, thank you for the question. I think as Alan has said at the outset, there are 2 main avenues. The European Convention on Human Rights is the primary one that the average Ukrainian can use. The European Convention on Human Rights was adopted, ratified, and signed by the Russian Federation in 1998, so it's bound by that convention. And Article 1 of the Convention says that the contracting parties shall secure to everyone within their jurisdictions the rights and freedoms defined in Section 1 of the Convention. Now, very often people think that the Convention on Human Rights deals with things like, as Alan has said, right to life, right against prohibition of torture, and things that are related to the individual, to the person. The Convention also deals with the protection of property. Article 8 specifically says that everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home, and his correspondence. And Protocol 1 provides that, sorry about that, Protocol 1 says that every natural or legal person is entitled to the peaceful enjoyment of his possession. No one shall be deprived of his possession except in the public interest and subject to the conditions provided for by law and by the general principles of international law. So that would give the basis for all those whose homes were destroyed, small businesses were destroyed, in order to seek compensation before the European Court on Human Rights. My colleague raised the issue of having to go through the national courts in order to be and to exhaust those recourses before going to the European Court on Human Rights. I would argue, and I would certainly test that before the European Court, the fact that it's a perfectly useless exercise to go through that in the Russian Federation for numerous reasons, including the reason that the Russian Constitutional Court has already rendered two decisions, one stating that the convention cannot override the constitution of the Russian Federation, and the second one, a specific one, saying that they will not enforce the UKO's decision because it contravenes the convention.
It contravenes which convention?
It contravenes the constitution of the Russian Federation. Sorry about that. Right. The second one is the Russian Federation has executed or concluded about 1/4 of the decisions rendered against it by the European Court on Human Rights. So I would certainly argue that the Russian Federation is arguing in a manner in violating international treaties, in rendering a decision, first a country that has rendered a decision stating that the decisions of the European Court on Human Rights shall not bind a contracting state, and the fact that they have executed or given satisfaction to about 1/4 of the decisions rendered against it would be elements that I would certainly challenge before the European Convention Court when confronted with an argument that one has to exhaust the exhaustion of all the courts in a given country. The second issue is jurisdiction, and I think on this issue, I think, as Alan has indicated, the decisions with Turkey and Cyprus, there's also a decision regarding Moldova where the courts have looked into the effective control in a given country. So in the case of Ukraine, one would argue that in eastern Ukraine, the 7% plus of the territories controlled by the Russian Federation is effective control, giving the European Court jurisdiction to hear a case for damages caused in that part of Ukraine, controlled by the Russian Federation. And in Crimea, the case would be even easier to make in view of the fact that the Russian Federation has so-called annexed Crimea to the Russian Federation, albeit that annexation has not been recognized by the international community. So I think that the elements are there in order to use the court for such damages at a cost that is not prohibitive for an individual that has suffered damages where his home was destroyed or he was subjected to torture, or for families that are suing for the loss of life. The other issue, the other avenue, I've communicated with a Ukrainian civic movement organization called Sila Prava. They have already sued the Russian Federation in Ukraine and have obtained about 200 judgments where they have split the proceedings into two. One, they look for a judgment on liability, and then take a second motion before those courts in order to seek damages. So there are now over 200 decisions that have declared as a fact that Russia aggressed Ukraine and has caused damages, and 15 cases where damages have been awarded. And what is interesting, certain interim measures have been already rendered by Ukrainian courts. For instance, seizing and arresting the bond that the Russian Federation has, the $3 billion bond that the Russian Federation has granted Ukraine during the Yanukovych years. So that becomes an avenue and a source of potential seizure and satisfaction of such judgments.
All right. One thing that perplexes me here, we're talking about people of small means. So the retribution is sought on an individual basis, or is a kind of class action suit?
The cases that Sila Prava has taken are all individual cases.
Now, if they seek compensation via a Russian loan that's in Ukrainian hands, I could see how this might work. But they're seeking through the European Convention. How does it work?
For the execution of judgments rendered by the European Court, one has to turn to the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, and then it becomes an issue for the international community to put the necessary pressure on the Russian Federation.
Right, but does that mean each individual case in Ukraine goes individually to the European Convention on Human Rights?
But I think you could do it in a. There is actually you could potentially, you could organise it in such a way, because you've got internally displaced people have the same fact pattern for each one. So you would be able to. You basically say, here is Mr. X et al. with 250,000 attached. There are ways of, I think you could structure it so it would effectively be amount to a class action, but you'd have to. But the problem with that is that the mass nature of the claim alone would mean that you would need major legal resources to run it. That's the problem.
Right.
But you could do it, and one of the issues for that is funding it to that degree, and how you do that. Alternatively, the Ukrainian state brings, and this actually happened with one of the Cyprus cases, the Cypriot government brought the claim on behalf of about 1,700 Cypriots, and they kind of they were bringing it as their right as a state to bring it, and then they against Turkey, and they attached all of the claims in relation to that. But but you have to ensure the fact pattern is the same, so the legal principle will be the same.
Very interesting.
Yeah, actually, the new law on reintegration of Donbas has a provision about consolidating those claims.
We noticed.
Yes, it hasn't been done yet, and I'm sure Ministry of Justice is working very hard on preparing this consolidated claim.
One of the observations when I looked at this last year was that I thought that they could adopt some of the US class action procedures here to be actually able to make this work to some degree. So that would be.
When you say they could adopt, you're saying this would be something new in the international scene, but it's plausible.
Yeah, pretty plausible. I think you could do this. Mass cases. You could actually play with that in a way which would work. Essentially, all of these people, the same legal provision is in place, the same party is involved, the same fact pattern is the same, is identical. So you can actually, for internally displaced people, all the key facts are the same. One argues about the amounts, but the key facts are the same. and therefore the only issue is on quantum. You'd have to have a kind of effectively a taxing judge in the common law world to go through the thing at the end to work out the quantum for each one. But the actual principle is the same for all. And that should be possible to do. And I think that one of the really interesting things will be to talk with the registrar and chief registrar of the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg as there is some flexibility in the rules to see how that could work as well. That's another thing to look at.
Maybe we should take this show to Strasbourg.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. To widen the aperture a little bit, Paula, I know you are concerned about a possible role for the United States, the U.S. government, U.S. Congress. We know that certain decisions taken without reference to Ukraine in recent days might have an impact on important industries in Ukraine. For those that I don't want to be too Delphic, I'm referring to tariffs on steel. With that in mind, Paula, I appreciate your view.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity to learn so much from my fellow panelists and from the previous panel. And I'm really thank you for pulling this together under the auspices of the Atlantic Council. I am not a lawyer, even though many people think I am. That's because I sat as, if you will, a judge at the U.S. International Trade Commission for 10 years, where I heard disputes and wrote opinions based on the law. And it has given me this aura of being a lawyer. My PhD's in international economics and politics. And politics and policy is what I want to talk about now. We're here in Washington, not Strasbourg or elsewhere. There are two issues, I think, that I want to put on the table that relate to the entire discussion with regard to Ukraine. They're both short-term and long-term. Short-term, as we know, the President of the United States is making decisions this week to decide what countries will be exempted from a 25% tariff on steel imports into the United States. And I am very struck by Anders' always excellent work and research and writings, in which he writes in the paper today, that is released today, the economic indicator that most clearly reflects the damage to Ukraine's economy from Russia's aggression is foreign trade. And further, the data spells out how much Ukraine has had to shift its foreign trade, its exports, in response to Russian sanctions against Ukraine. And particularly this has occurred in the metallurgy arena, in steel in particular. And so it seems to me that the most short-term first thing that would be on the minds of policy leaders and political leaders in talking to President Trump would be to assure that Ukraine was exempted based on the national security concerns that this president has expressed and are the basis upon which he is putting on the 25% tariff on steel under Section 232. That's the trade law that is before him today. So that is very short term, and I've got to say that the Trump administration, I've been conscious of this, very involved in watching that back in July last year, the Trump administration did extend a suspension agreement that was put in 2014 when the aggressions began. And did so on a particular steel product, which was the all-country tubular goods. And so the idea of not extending that suspension agreement, which will expire in July, or the idea of putting the 25% tariff on top of what is already the restrictions under the suspension agreement that have to do with price and volume disciplines of the steel coming in, seems to me contrary to what this U.S. government is standing for with regard to the passage of legislation that the president signed last year, et cetera. So that's kind of short term. Long term, as we all know, when we deal with bilateral investment treaties and with the international courts, particularly in the various tribunals, which Irina spelled out, the potentially 7 different tribunals that you could take the bit that Ukraine, the bilateral investment treaty, excuse me, that Ukraine signed with Russia and pursue a compensation. I've had a lot of experience in that too after I left the government. I spent, I think it was about 11 years, working behind the scenes to assure that an international arbitration claim that was achieved by the lawyers was actually enforced. And as Alan said at the very beginning, enforcement is the key issue here if you want to put your hand in the pockets of the person who has taken the money out of your pocket. I work behind the scenes on behalf of very large corporations who had won an award but could not get it enforced. In that case, it was in Pakistan. And I actually never went into Pakistan, never set foot into Pakistan. I did it all with quiet diplomacy behind the scenes with, I would say, tremendous cooperation from the U.S. government bureaucrats, diplomats, officials who helped assure that ultimately the enforcement was put into place in Pakistan. It took 3 different presidents of the United States for me to deal with, et cetera. But it was an interesting story. One of the things that I did, and I checked today to see if anything has been done here in the U.S. government about this, is that I made sure that in the annual report that the trade representative has to publish on barriers to trade and investment of the United States included, for the first time ever, the failure to enforce a BIT, or a failure to enforce an international arbitration. So, I mean, that's just, I've just given away some very valuable advice. And I think there are many other forms of leverage. And I do believe that the work that has been done here at the Atlantic Council by Anders and by you, Alan, in your publication 4 years ago, which pointed to so much of this that then Anders has reported on today, is really ready to be worked upon. So I want to make sure that I've made my 2 points about the short term and the long term. And I do understand that sometimes it can be a slog, as I said, with respect to my experience. So I think you've got so many wonderful experts here, but I do believe enforcement is really going to be the key, and the U.S. government and public policy, together with our allies and the European courts and other tribunals, are also very key. But I think that, as Irina pointed out, the precedents in one don't necessarily stand up in the others. And I'm going to say one last thing from a policy point of view. As a person, as a practitioner, and as a scholar, and as someone who seeks the truth, I find it extremely, extremely difficult to swallow the fact that I cannot use the precedents from previous decisions that are made by these international tribunals. It seems to me that it would have made my life a lot easier, but thanks to just the principles that I argued on behalf of my clients, we still managed to prevail. But it took a lot of persistence, and it might have been a lot easier if the precedents had been been made public in some form. So I would argue even for some reform there too.
Okay, thank you. I know everyone wants to get at the lawyers, but I have one short question because I think it's very interesting, and I'd like to get an opinion on this. One thing we have not discussed is the bridge over the Straits of Kerch. As a result of that bridge, there was a period where no Ukrainian shipping was allowed into and out of the Sea of Azov. And my understanding from Admiral Kabanyenko is that when the bridge is completed, it's of such a size that certain ships will not be able to proceed, ships that are necessary, especially to move, I think, steel or ore.
Wow.
So, Alan, any sense as to damages that could be claimed as a result of restrictions on Ukrainian shipping and the damage that would do to the Ukrainian economy in Donbas?
Well, I think there's a number. I mean, the thing which immediately strikes you is UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Effectively, they are illegally undermining the rights of navigation, the free rights of navigation of Ukrainian shipping. So you would have, I mean, and there, of course, you've got the option of going to the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. So there is, that is one immediate option. And of course, the difficulty for the Russians in that tribunal is you would have an international tribunal immediately ruling that they are illegally annexing, it's a legal annexation of Crimea, and you'd get a ruling from an international tribunal recognised by the United Nations. So there is there are a series of issues there. You may be able, I think, probably to structure bilateral investment argument as well, but for those ships who are effectively running through Ukrainian-owned but Russian-controlled territory as well. But the most immediate obvious one is via the UNCLOS, going into and raising the rights of navigation for Ukrainian shipping, it would seem to me.
Okay, thank you. Questions?
John, let me just comment on something Alan was saying. You were talking about if Ukraine could beef up the class action provisions in order to take for individuals to be able to take a class action. That is one aspect, but I think that in terms of enforcement, once you get the various judgments that people are getting, to arrest a judgment or an asset that was already arrested by someone else is not a complicated procedure. And I think that is one way within Ukraine to be able to enforce a judgment in an effective and cost-efficient manner. The second one is now Naftogaz, in order to collect the judgment that it obtained against Gazprom, is going to be executing not only within Ukraine but also outside, and has there are about 25 bilateral agreements between Ukraine and other countries.
Yeah, but I think what they'll do is to do it. The fastest way to do it is to do it via the New York Convention, because you can register.
You can do that too.
And I think the point about it is then you execute them. The thing about the interesting thing about the NAFTA gas arbitration ruling is this: it shows you what you potentially could do, and there is the prospect of some speed. When we're talking a couple of years, which in legal terms is very fast.
Yeah.
But the point about it is, it's all relative. But the point about it is, you've got a ruling, and you potentially. And the point about it is I'm only half joking about the Nord Stream 2 point, was that the point about Nord Stream 2 is that 70% of the assets, 70% of the finance for that is external finance. So even before we talk about it actually being enforced, it's the prospect that, soon as the NAFTA gas management announce that they're going to be seeking registration under the New York Convention, that would put every financier, every bank, and all the corporate Western partners of Nord Stream 2 on notice that they have a problem. And I think that is this is the sort of thing you can shows you what potentially you could do. I mean, one of the other arguments I've got about this is that there is a strategic Ukrainian position with seeking assets. If the state particularly is going down the route of bringing some of these cases or state-owned companies, one of the options is to seek assets which basically are profitable to Ukraine but enhance Western security. So one of the arguments is can you seize Gazprom storage, Gazprom pipelines and so forth, and bring them into control of Ukraine on EU territory, which undermine Gazprom's monopoly, which help all of the European allies. So you can see what you do is you get a double benefit. And that is a double whammy, if you like. And that is a sort of strategic litigation approach, which could, win your friends and influence people quite significantly, and has multiple benefits.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Back. Please identify yourself.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your brilliant presentations. My name is Andriy Pasechnik. I am a counselor of the Embassy of Ukraine here in DC. And I still keep on working in the core MFA legal team that launched all of this process that we're talking about since very morning. So if you allow me, I would like to begin with several very, very short comments on what was mentioned before. So, and then I'll ask my question to the lawyers. So the Kerch Bridge. You clearly and rightfully identified UNCLOS as a venue where Ukraine could try to defend its right. And I must admit that it's already there. The claim is already in the tribunal. It's not ITLOS because neither Russian Federation nor Ukraine recognized ITLOS jurisdiction while ratifying the UNCLOS Convention, but it's ad hoc tribunal established under Annex 7, if I'm not mistaken, of the UNCLOS. So it's already there. It's part of a claim. Also, also on the European Court of Human Rights issue, where we all began. You know that, and it was mentioned by the following speakers, that Russia basically put up a mechanism where Russian Constitutional Court is able to review all uncomfortable rulings of the European Court for Human Rights and basically revert it. So returning to possibilities of individuals to go to the European Court for Human Rights to seek defense and seek damages from Russian Federation are very limited, I must say. If UKOS, with all its abilities, all its power, influence, were not able to get through the Constitutional Court of Russian Federation, then, how would small individuals pursue the same path and succeed? It's a very small chances for them to succeed. And also you mentioned the UN Compensation Commission for for Kuwait. It's an excellent example. It was in our minds from the very beginning of the occupation, from early March 2014. In the MFA, we had this idea. But the biggest problem is that you had to take this mechanism through the Security Council of the United Nations, where Russia has a veto power. One example for you: an MH17 tribunal that was floating on the top of all of the events related to MH17, and 5 countries, like the JIT group comprising of the Netherlands, Ukraine, Belgium, Australia, and Malaysia, came up with an idea which was supported positively by all 15 members of the Security Council back in 2015, but Russia vetoed it. So the same would happen with this UN Compensation Commission. So finally, I got to my question. So what's your take on the following? Do you think that those individuals who are trying to seek compensations from Russia, including the European Court for Human Rights (VNU), would be able to get something in the final, in maybe somewhere in distant future, where there will be final reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia on everything what was going on? Because, I mean, all wars come to an end. This will end sooner or later, and there will be some sort of reconciliation between the states. Do you think that individuals would be able to get their share of a pie or not? Thank you very much.
Okay, can I come back on some of that? My point about the ECHR is, and it's true, of course, UKOS got 1.8 billion, and there's a small matter of how does one enforce it, given. But and they've also got another $50 billion claim, which they're also working on via a bilateral investment treaty route. But the first thing to think about is this: that there is an issue about small claims, and we talked about the creating a procedure which would make it you could effectively run some form of class action. But it is worth doing because it is pinning liability on the Russians, and at some point we'll be able to bring claims. So I think there's an issue about how we do it, but we should do it because it pins liability on them and fixes them with liability. So that is the first thing. The second thing is on the United Nations Compensation Commission. I think it's a model, but we don't do it at Security Council level. We can do it amongst the Western powers and allies such as Ukraine. And we run an international compensation commission, which would not be under the United Nations, and which would allow for the freezing of Russian state-owned assets across the West, and for the Compensation Commission have the right to essentially compensate the victims of the Putin regime. That is, I think, the way you structure it. And I think the way things are moving in the United States and in other parts of the West, we may well get there. Which brings me to my other point about compensation, that I do not think there's any possibility of reconciliation for as long as the current regime remains in power. But I think we may be able to get compensation sooner than that because of the willingness to potentially freeze and seize Russian assets. But we will see where we go with that.
Just like to answer from my perspective, we were talking about the European Court on Human Rights. At the end of the day, I think people have to recognize the fact that we are dealing with a country that does not respect the international order, does not abide by the international treaties it has signed, and one needs to deal with them as such. And I think that the Convention on Human Rights allows us to do that, because the ultimate responsibility for the execution and enforcement of final decisions of the court belongs to the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. So it's both a legal and a political issue. And the international community will eventually have to decide how long will it tolerate a country that endangers international order, violates our most basic conventions and agreements, violates the agreements it has signed before the ink has dried on the agreement, i.e. the Minsk agreements. And at the end of the day, the international community will have to say, with the Council of Europe and the Committee of Ministers and various other agencies, bodies, and governments, whether it will allow the Russian Federation to endanger peace and security in the world, or whether it will take measures that will address the issue in a meaningful way. And I think that this is why I'm saying it's not just a legal issue. We cannot fight with legal tools against somebody that does not respect the tools. And as powerful as you said the Yukos case might be and the individuals behind it, at the end of the day, you can't do anything other than a political decision against a country that signs in 1998 or ratifies in 1998 the Convention on Human Rights, and then when a decision does not go its way, comes up with a ruling that the Constitutional Court can set aside the agreement. In November 2016, when the International Criminal Court has rendered a decision that Crimea was occupied, the Russian Federation stated it will walk out of the International Criminal Court. That is why it's not just, we cannot play with legal tools that are available against somebody that violates those same tools. And that's why at the end of the day, the international community will have to decide whether it will enforce our most fundamental freedoms and rights in a meaningful way. And there are tools for that.
Thank you. I respect what you said, and I think it's very, very important to elevate that back up to the discussion. But I wanted to build on Alan's response to the questioner in the, from the Embassy of Ukraine, because I started to ask myself, and I want to ask actually you, so we get to turn the tables on the moderator here, who hasn't even said anything except asking questions, and he is such a source of wisdom here. So I'm taking charge here.
As always.
Is it possible that in the dialogue, the Minsk dialogue and its successors, that the discussion can spend as much time or more time, and the policymakers might spend as much and more time on the issues of compensation in the effort to find some sort of ultimate reconciliation, which you were looking at in the future. I say this because I recognize that the U.S. has sold this year and made policy changes with regard to military sales to Ukraine. I recognize because people are being killed every single day, maybe that's an exaggeration, but it is a ruthless area in the occupied areas that belong to sovereign Ukraine territory. And that there's just a lot of attention on the military side. And of course, today has given us the opportunity to talk about other ways of maybe advancing towards that ultimate reconciliation without firing shots. I'm not saying put down your, put down your arms. Not at all. I do not believe in unilateral disarmament. But I'm wondering if our policymakers could spend more time in the negotiations talking about a compensatory system pending some ultimate reconciliation at some undetermined future period of nirvana. So I'm just, what do you think?
First, I'm not in the government, so I'm not part of official negotiations.
No, right.
I'm reasonably well informed about them, but I'm not completely informed. I also have participated in some Track 2 things. Certainly compensation is one issue which is within the realm of talks. But as far as I know, it has not been discussed in any serious way. It has not even been broached as an issue to be tabled. Normally speaking, and I base this on lots of experience in the State Department, in a situation like this, diplomats are focused on ending ongoing damage as opposed to redressing prior damage. And I think that's actually a very pragmatic and sensible approach. I think there's a possibility of a diplomatic solution in the foreseeable future. When I say possibility, I'm not talking about a likelihood. And I don't see that possibility including a serious discussion in serious terms relating to compensation. But probably that's, if there is such a solution, it would not rule it out. Long story short, that means that I don't think compensation is part of the diplomatic package at the present time, but it could be in the future.
Should it be?
Well, it cannot be ignored. But I've looked at this issue not just in the context of the current war between Russia and Ukraine, but I spent a lot of time dealing with failed states and some of the awful human consequences of failed states. And there is a point of view on that issue that says you must absolutely have compensation, otherwise you're setting up historic grievances which then become the source of future conflict. There's an opposing view which says resolving those issues is so difficult, don't take on something which is absolutely unnecessary to stop the fighting. Bottom line, you need to be pragmatic and look at it on a case-by-case basis. And again, if I were responsible for resolving the conflict in Donbas, I would try and get the conflict over, stop the fighting, get Russian troops and Russian weapons and Russian financing out of Ukraine, and then deal with compensation at a later date. But that's just one man's view.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Keith Spessy, but question really to
Keith,
Alan.
why don't you use the microphone?
Oh, thanks. Sorry. Question to Alan. I have to confess I'm a little dubious of the EU and their claims, competition policy claims against the U.S. have been fulfilled, competition policy claims against Russia. A lot of talk, no action, because Russia comes back and says, "Oh, you do that, and we'll take action against your firms in Russia," and then the EU backs off. And my question is there any chance of really getting the EU to kind of move on this? We see what the sorry example of the Minsk agreements with Europe unable to really to push Russia to even fulfill the Minsk agreements that were signed twice. And now the question on compensation, is there any way to really push this in a way that the EU would be a little better than they have been in the past in dealing with Russia?
Well, I mean, there are two or three things. One is the ECHR is a Council of Europe thing, which is separate from the EU as such. Right. So that's one element of it. But I think if you talk about, if you pull back a bit and say, you know, all the Europeans basically cheesy shooting surrender monkeys and all of this. The truth is actually, you know, they have kept sanctions rolled over every 6 months. Nobody is actually, there's not a problem with that. The other thing is notwithstanding all the populism, there are other things going on. I think you saw France and Germany joining with the UK and the US over the condemnation of the poisonings in the UK. I think there is a recognition increasingly that Russia is a growing threat and is attacking. There's a kind of, whether one calls it, I think the phrase in the House of Commons was used was a warlike state rather than an act of war. But there's a sense of increasing hostility which has to be responded to. This is like the growing threat which really we have to deal with is there. And to some degree, what I'm relying on here is Mr. Putin once again. He helped us tremendously with energy security, and he's helping us again once here for the West to realise the real nature, or the Europeans to realise the nature of the threat. And I think that is coming. That is actually pushing through into a lot of European societies that the Putin regime is a problem, which wasn't the case, I think, even after the invasion of Ukraine. But I think that is something which is coming. Now, it's not complete. If you look at the polls in Germany, they trust Vladimir Putin more than they trust Donald Trump. But the point is, well, I won't go there. But anyhow, the point is that it gives you. But the point about it is, there is the overall shift is into a much more skeptical view of Russia than a few years ago. The sense that anything can be done constructively is there, and also I think businesses as well. If you look at the amount of actual European business in Russia outside the energy sector, there's very little going on. Everything has shrunk. The opportunities which were once seen there, no one's going to go there.
Well, any other comments on the panel? I think we're.
I want to make a final comment. We can speculate about reconciliation or maybe the claims commission or something, but I think the claimants should not be relying on this. I think the claimants should be filing their claims now, massively, and those precedents that already are happening show that it can be done. It is being done. And I think these claims will ripen and accumulate, and the aggregate amount of those claims, I think, will be and is already preventing Russia from doing more atrocities. And one of the examples is that they withdrew from several oil fields in Odessa, offshore, which they basically cordoned off with military ships, and it has nothing to do with Crimea. They just came and stole them, basically. And they voluntarily withdrew recently from there.
When did that happen?
That happened, they withdrew just recently. They abandoned those.
I should have known that, thank you.
Yeah, but I think they did it because they realized, they just calculated all the pending claims, and they saw that this will be just another major claim.
Right.
So I think this is a very strong tool that is working already, and everybody who has a claim should go and file their claim. European Court of Human Rights, international investment arbitration, state against state. There should be massive claims filed against the Russian Federation.
Any other comments?
I think that legal recourses have been discussed, that they're available. People, I agree, should be taking those proceedings. But at the end of the day, I think they need to be buttressed by strong government support, where the international community will have to very clearly decide whether it is willing to tolerate the situation that is ongoing, or take additional measures in order to ensure that we solve the issue. I think the decisions that Canada and the United States have taken in December in facilitating for Ukraine to obtain defensive lethal weapons, I think, as Alan has said, the renewal of sanctions, I think that if we can actually go and talk not only of a renewal of sanctions, but strengthening of sanctions, because there's plenty of reasons to strengthen the sanctions in view of the recent activities of the Russian Federation, then we will create conditions that will enable, first, as John, you've said, to solve the pending problem that is ongoing, which is that every single week there are Ukrainian soldiers and civilians that are dying. Every single day there are Ukrainians that are injured, and that we will settle that issue and then address in an effective way the issue of compensation.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much.
Well, I was just going to close by saying this was about Kremlin aggression in Ukraine and restitutions on private property. Again, from a U.S. point of view, sanctions are not the only tools in our toolbox. And as I said today, this week, the president really has enormous presidential power that he is using. He doesn't have to go to Congress for new sanctions. And the idea of putting on a 25% tariff on the Ukrainian steel in the context of what we've been speaking about today is truly amazing. As I see, there's been a 30% decline in steel exports from Ukraine between 2011 and 2016. There's hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians that depend upon their jobs and their livelihood and their families' livelihoods that relate to the steel that used to go to Russia, cannot go to Russia, and is finding alternative Western markets, one of which in a very small amount, as far as U.S. Steel producers is concerned, is Ukraine. So it seems to me it's just it's staring us in the face this week here in Washington, D.C.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.